Thank you, David. And I thank you. I thank all the people of Vermont. I have no roots in Vermont. I was born in Connecticut, and my wife has never forgiven me about moving to the Midwest. And so I told her this is as close as you're going to get to Connecticut. And it's one of my colleagues invited me for a weekend in Vermont about 20 years ago. That was a big mistake because I never went home, really. I mean, we're moving to Vermont permanently this summer. Greensboro is a little more rural. If some of you know, it's a lot more rural. I was just there this morning, but we're going to make a go of it. So thank you, Vermont. And I want to thank you for an opportunity, which I hope I don't regret in about 45 minutes, to share with you what is a work in progress. Most lecturers like myself like to be very certain about what they tell the people. And my thinking about the topic tonight is somewhat provisional. It's in process. But it is my effort to rethink what I think about the American Revolution. And to some extent, it's an outgrowth of my previous book, The American Insurgents, American Patriots. The goal being, perhaps because of my Irish background, shall we say, I try to see the revolution as a populist movement, a movement of the people. I'm interested not so much in founding fathers, but the folks that did the heavy lifting, that showed up in battles, that sacrificed their farms in order to create our independence. And so I tend to come at it from this popular tangent. In the lecture tonight and the next book that I'm writing extend some of my argument about thinking of these people. Now, I should tell you, in case any of you don't read about the American Revolution, it's a vast literature, as you can imagine. The people have never been very favored in the story of our revolution. They tend to go missing. And you might wonder, well, why? I mean, shouldn't we be proud of the folks that did the fighting? Or whatever. And the answer is most of the historical literature doesn't take that view. The people become kind of voiceless spectators to what the founding fathers were up to. And so when you suggest that we should have a populist interpretation of the American Revolution, you can almost feel the uneasiness that develops, especially among certain scholarly circles. Oh my God, you're talking about mobs, you're talking about anarchy, you're talking about violence and disorder. And I always retort, has there ever been a revolution that succeeded that didn't have these elements in it? I mean, get used to it. Violence and disorder. Without it, you have a sort of a Norman Rockwell revolution. You've all seen those people that just stepped out of a dry cleaner, they're immaculate clothes, and you say, that's not the revolution. There's no there. And so I've tried to think of a revolution in which we wouldn't start telling ourselves about founding fathers. Now, I have great respect for the founding fathers. I'm not going to come here and tell you that George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or John Adams weren't terrific, smart, able people and helped the cause a lot. So don't misunderstand me. But we also know perhaps too much about these people. I mean, we know about their diets, their clothes. In Thomas Jefferson's case, we know about things he did out behind the mansion that perhaps is a little disconcerting for those that are founding father advocates. But I would tell you that I've faced in my own career people that say, yeah, it's really great that you're restoring the people. And then the next question is, did you know where George Washington slept in Connecticut? And you're just like, please listen to what we're trying to say. So what the challenge for me, and your suggestions would be most welcome, is to create a new narrative or a different narrative of the American Revolution that would include the people, but in a way that they're not a problem. They're not a mob, but maybe we could restore the people in a way that we could be proud of the ordinary folks for what they contributed in the construction of our own political culture. Again, if I was talking to founding fathers, we would get all teary-eyed about the Constitution and the Declaration, and we say, isn't it wonderful what they wrote? I'm going to try tonight, and in this project, to do the same thing for the ordinary people, and tell you a story about their accomplishment that shaped our lives in a very, very positive way. And I'm going to tell you about 3 areas where the people led the way. And without the guidance or help of the famous founding fathers, engaged in one of what I think is one of the most creative moments in American political history. The 3 points I'm going to stress tonight are the maintenance, in the darkest time of the revolution, of an enduring political culture, of maintaining laws under great stress, of the creation on the ground level of meaningful religious toleration long before Jefferson or Madison came around to rewriting the laws of Virginia in the 1780s. And most important, that it was the people that instilled into our political vocabulary in a way that has never been erased, thank God, a language of rights, human rights, civil rights, natural rights. Because that is not the language of the founding fathers. They spoke a different ideology about virtue, about republicanism, and so on. That's fine. But the people, in the darkest days of the revolution, made sure that the laws were the basis of settling disputes, that their neighbors of different religions would not be harmed because of their personal and spiritual beliefs, and that when push came to shove, our relations with each other in a civil society are based on mutual respect of God-given universal rights. These are not little things, ladies and gentlemen, but if we don't look at the people, we can't possibly appreciate their creativity. So let me start with the culture of law, the first of the people's contribution. Now, the legal, or more precisely, the constitutional history of the American Revolution has not suffered for want of study. Some of you may know this literature. We know a lot about formal constitutional arguments advanced by leading lawyers in the eve of independence about the rights of Parliament to rule over us. And much of the recent scholarship of the late 18th century law analyzes this constitutional law as an abstract bundle of jurisprudential principles. And this work allows me and anybody who reads it to speak confidently about such matters as the evolution of contract law or the evolution of corporate law. I know that this is a literature. But if we concentrate tonight our attention on a less elevated level of experience, on the face of the law as it appeared in small communities throughout revolutionary America, I would tell you a different picture begins to emerge. Throughout the revolutionary period, ordinary men and ordinary women, and I'm not just dropping that to be politically correct, because when you go down to the ground level, as I found in my research, there were real revolutionary women, just as there are guys. It's just that there aren't founding mothers like founding fathers, but on the local level, you get both. But throughout this period, these people turned repeatedly to the county courts to obtain remedies for disputes that may strike some of us or some historians as commonplace. The majority of these actions involved the civil law as opposed to criminal law. They involved trespass on case, contracts for debt, for example. And often the process impressed outsiders at the time as primitive, this law of local communities. A Virginia merchant who had legal business in the state of, or the colony of North Carolina in 1753 was unimpressed by the scene of a county court that greeted him. But listen to what the law on the ground is like. No one in the little country seat looked distinguished, and yet from this collection of disheveled persons, the justices were selected, raised to the bench, and given authority to decide the fates of their countrymen. Law in a local society. So that whatever the local traditions or the ancient traditions of the common law may have been, ordinary people who sat on juries decided throughout America, the juries decided exactly what constituted the law in matters argued before them. If any of you are lawyers, you'll find this as an earlier kind of jury. Judges frequently expressed frustration at the system, noted that a few country plaintiffs or lawyers, few of them bothered to observe the formal or confusing pleadings of the common law. As one contemporary explained, any person of contemporary ability or common abilities can easily distinguish between right and wrong, and do so more especially when the parties are admitted to give a plain story without puzzles from the lawyers. People knew what justice was without the help of the complex Latin or ancient French pleadings. Now, much has been made in the historiography of the profound impact that the Revolution had on the practice of American law. Without question, if we expand the temporal horizon to include, say, the early half of the 19th century, we will encounter major changes in corporate and constitutional law. We do, if you take the longer view. But in the short run, in the run that people that we're talking about live, the story is quite different, except for the fact that post-revolutionary writs no longer bore the name of George III, and instead proclaimed the authority of states such as New York and Massachusetts. The legal culture on the ground remained much the same as it had been in the colonial period. The legal culture is not changing before and after the Revolution. In civil actions, juries composed of familiar men from the community continue to do exactly what their fathers and their grandfathers had always done. They cut through the arcane maze of common law pleadings and delivered decisions that made good sense to their neighbors. As the legal historian at NYU, William Nelson, explained in one documented state, that's Massachusetts, there is absolutely no evidence that the men who led Massachusetts into the Revolution, or any that followed, acted for the purpose of bringing about fundamental changes in the law. Nor can it be persuasively argued that the Revolution itself, the closing of the courts by the Crown Courts in 1775, disrupted a deep sense of the workings of everyday law on the ground. Let me give you an example. In every county and town in America after 1774, committees of safety and observation were formed in order to look out for people that perhaps were buying tea or giving aid and comfort to the enemy. These committees might have adopted arbitrary rules. They could have become kangaroo courts. Think of other revolutions you've studied. This is a moment where revolutionary, unconstitutional bodies are taking control of local life. Okay? What happens? Let's follow a case of one very scrupulously documented committee in New Haven, Connecticut. In 1774, the Continental Congress empowered these committees to look after anybody that had violated the local boycott. And the members of the New Haven Committee promised that any person, quote, accused of willful breach of these orders will understand the full force of revolutionary law. Whoa, that sounds really scary. What did it mean, in fact? The New Haven Committee made it clear that they were concerned that they would not violate basic assumptions relating to due process. The committee pledged, in their words, that persons accused and the answers shall be, that he or she shall give, shall be open, fairly, and fully heard. Witnesses must be brought forward as well as proofs. So much for arbitrary revolutionary justice. And after the evidence had been presented, and only then did the New Haven Committee proceed, and I quote, deliberately and coolly to determine the question of whether the person accused has violated the revolutionary orders or not, end quote. Now you might say, well, this committee behaved just as you would expect it to do. Fair, equitable procedures, but that's not the point. We should not take the preservation of due process in a revolutionary environment for granted. It is quite an accomplishment. It was something that had to be preserved. What we tend to overlook as historians is that this committee, as well as hundreds of other committees operating throughout America at this time, could have resorted to capricious and vindictive behavior. But they did not. Any comparative study of revolution reveals dramatically. Think of the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the revolutions that freed colonies throughout the Third World. Think of that as you hear that it is far easier to destroy a culture of common law than to preserve it during very troubled times. And yet that's what we see in the American situation. And after the revolution, nothing much changed. Ordinary Americans continued to seek remedies for personal grievances and civil disputes in the local courts. These were trusted institutions manned by local people that understood the needs of justice in these situations. And they tended, if anything, to think that lawyers were bad news. Terrible. My point here is that sometimes you find these committees or these local courts complaining about the lawyers, not because they're questioning law or legal culture, but doubting whether lawyers are able to be the voice of true justice in these situations at all. As one leader in Worcester County, Massachusetts said, I have no intention to destroy public law, but to have the Court of Common Pleas understand that lawyers sometimes prevent justice rather than aiding it. So the preservation of the rule of law on the local level, an achievement ordinary people were able to bring about because they wanted to settle debt. They wanted to have deeds registered. They wanted to ask whether their neighbors' hogs had any business in their fields. This is what maintained law on the ground. Now, I ask you to turn it, if, as the nation's founding fathers had been truly accurate when they feared that the people would bring anarchy and misrule, and sometimes Washington talked that way, there would have been no successful revolution. In fact, the secure foundation of law throughout revolutionary America made it possible for the founding fathers to deliberate about strengthening local government. In other words, they were operating out of a foundation that they could trust. One of the books that I've used so much, and I highly recommend it, because it was written in Vermont in 1794. Some of you may be aware of Samuel Williams' really, truly wonderful history, The Natural and Civil History of Vermont. Any of you looked at that? Well, you're in for a treat, because it's far, far better than Thomas Jefferson's much more famous book on the Notes on the State of Virginia.
We have that here.
Yeah. Williams wrote, think of this, Vermonters, The common farmer in America hath a more comprehensive view of the law, of the rights and privileges than the speculative philosophers of Europe could ever have on this subject, end quote. But who do we read about when we think of speculative philosophers? The founding fathers, not the people that are making these courts work. So the culture of law. Looking at my watch, so my host won't attack me when I'm not looking. So the recognition of a resilient culture of law is only part of the study. A new revolutionary, a new populist narrative of the revolution must take into account the experience of religious toleration. Now, my argument is that although the nation's founders, particularly Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, have received much of the credit for securing religious toleration in the young republic, their achievement depended upon tens of thousands of ordinary Americans, most of them farmers, who had established a working toleration on the ground long before it had to be translated into law or legislation into Virginia. The people, in other words, are ahead of their leaders on some points. How do we get a handle on this? The story, I think, should begin with the greatest revival moment in American history, something called the Great Awakening, which transformed popular religion in the colonies. The Reverend George Whitefield invited ministers of all sects to become evangelicals to share the news of the new birth. And the itinerants carried word of the new birth in Christ on country roads up and down the South throughout New England. By the 1760s, some of the emotional force of Whitefield's movement had cooled, but not much. On the eve of the American Revolution, small congregations in almost every colony experienced the full force of the revival of the Spirit. Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians competed and they competed aggressively with older sects, the more established faiths, Congregationalists, the Episcopalians. It is hard for any historian working in this field to overestimate the effects of itinerant preachers upon scattered little communities. I can only give you a few examples, but let me give you my favorite. It comes from a diary of a woman that lived in Long Island, Mary Cooper. She ran a modest farm by herself. She was a single mother. And in her diary, she reported a stream of evangelists that came to Long Island. They were extremely obscure figures. No one bothered to register their names. In June 1769, she attended a Quaker meeting where, quote, where a multitude were gathered to hear a woman preach, end quote. Soon thereafter, she heard a sermon by a, quote unquote, Indian preacher. She hung on the words of several African American itinerants. Cooper confided in her diary that she listened to, quote, some Indian and one black man preach the entire day. She reminds us what most historians of my field have forgotten, that on the ground in these little communities, you have a world in motion, people on the road bringing the news of a new religious faith. If you look at the founding fathers and you worry about deism and abstract thought, you miss what's happening to the people. Mary Cooper reminds us about the power of the stirrings of a redeemed heart. And we should remember that these evangelicals competed fiercely for converts. Often their personal accounts reveal an obsession with numbers. They describe a great contest for souls. On any given day, they celebrated the new birth of 500 new souls, often 1,000. Black, white, men, women, all came forward in these accounts to shed their sinfulness. And the itinerants left behind them congregations that were often deeply divided, churches split. And during one of the greatest revivals in the 1780s in New England, known as the Great Stir, that's right, S-T-I-R, evangelical figures fractured communities and brought forth strange-sounding groups. You won't believe this, little religious groups that are lost because we don't pay attention to what the people are up to. But I'll give you these names. The Comer Outers, the Merry Dancers, the Doralites, and the Universalists that defined religion in Vermont more than any other group. They were fiercely anti-authoritarian. Okay, what's the point here? By whatever name, these ministries served the Lord. And listen to the words of the Reverend Jesse Lee, who was one of the most prominent Methodists in the late 18th century. He was imprisoned briefly by the Continental Army in North Carolina, but jail did not silence Lee, nor erode his appeal to the regular troops. As soon as it was light, I was up and began to sing, and some hundreds of people assembled and joined with me. And we made the plantation sing with the songs of Zion. And when we kneeled down and prayed loud, and many of the poor soldiers who had arrested me were weeping in tears. And on another occasion, Lee observed, many of the people, many of the officers, as well as soldiers, were bathed in tears before I was done. He was preaching to them through the bars of his cell, you see. And when Lee began to pray, no one in the American military units protested, stop him, because he's a Methodist. That was not what's on offer. Lee served their spiritual needs. All that mattered was that their religious needs were served. You see, on the ground, toleration for the soldiers that were serving in those continental units in the South. Toleration was a lived experience where farm families eager to have their children baptized welcomed the ministry of the traveling itinerants. In colonial Virginia, the Anglican Church had always been a little shallow about the number of ministers, and so these new traveling itinerants supplied the faith of the people. No one asked ordinary people, are you a Presbyterian? Are you a Baptist? Hey, you might be a Methodist, eh? No. They said, what do you bring to the people about the word of the new birth? And as Lee's account of Army life suggests, soldiers found themselves constantly in arms with men of other religious backgrounds, of other sects. Chaplains comforted the wounded and the dying. And at these moments, not a single soul said, are you an Orthodox minister? Are you a man of a particular faith? They served the spiritual needs of the people on the ground. And so what we encounter in these accounts is a mixture of intense religious competition and highly charged emotions that could easily have sparked serious and sustained sectarian violence. We don't think about that in America. Religious competition, and yet if you know anything about the history of Germany after the 30 or 40 years wars, you know, well, my God, all you have to do is read the New York Times today. Shiites, Sunnis, you can see it can go terribly wrong very quickly. But rivalry in America did not trigger these unpleasant results. As Crèvecoeur, the Frenchman that observed revolutionary America, wrote in his essays, American individuals, and this is where the quotation picks up, are free to differ from any of their religious opinions which are received by their neighbors. This is an amazing indulgence, which, being granted to all, does not at the least disturb American society, but rather serves to unite it in all of its subdivisions. This is a problem which a great many people in Europe cannot comprehend, prejudices as they are to a certain religious affiliation. We have competition, difference, but no violence, no religious anarchy. Back to Samuel Williams, again, my favorite. He disagreed with Crèvecoeur only on one point, and that point is important. He said that the government has no ability to grant toleration, as if it was a gift that, our rulers could give us. It's rather different. And he said, in Vermont, some people are Episcopalians, others Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Baptists, and Quakers. And he's quote here, all of them find their need of assistance in each other, in the common concerns and business of life. And all of them are persuaded that the government of Vermont has nothing to do with a particular religion or a distinguishing tenet. It is not toleration that the people of Vermont want, but equality, which the people aim at. See, you have religion. The state protects us, but does not give it to us. Good man, Williams. And so when Jefferson and Madison wrote in the 1780s their famous acts about religious freedom, they were already late in the game. How do I know that? Because of the things I've told you, but more. The state legislature of Virginia received petitions from all over Virginia. One I've not seen, but is reputed to be 200 feet long. Imagine how many signatures are. And these are people that said, enough already. Just, we can live together. Just pass the law for religious freedom. This is a classic case where the people were ahead of their rulers in an important way. So we've done two. We've seen how a culture of law was protected in a difficult time. We've seen how people experienced religious toleration in a competitive environment in which people learned to gather strength from other sects rather than see it as a threat to be crushed. And the third strand that I would say we should celebrate in a new revolutionary history is the language of rights. Now this may come as a surprise to you. You may think that the revolution was all about rights, but you wouldn't say that if you read the great historians at Harvard and Yale and places like that today, because they would tell you that the ideology of the American Revolution had nothing to do with rights nor with law, but was based on something called republicanism, which called forth human virtue of a fear of corruption of power. And so these texts that I'm attacking have long quotations from Jefferson and Madison and so on, right? Founding fathers. Did the founding fathers believe it? Absolutely. How about the people? You find it's a classic case where the ideology of the common folks was not that of their leaders. At least it took a different register. The people that showed up at Concord and Lexington, the folks that showed up at Bunker Hill spoke a different political language. They passionately and emotionally proclaimed to all that would hear their God-given rights. And they talked about the people's appeal to heaven. Appeal to heaven. It was on the first battle flag that the boys at Bunker Hill designed before Washington took command of the Continental Army. It's a pine tree on a white background, and underneath it is an appeal to heaven. And a lot of historians before I came along, I know I'm engaging in little self-congratulation, but it was seen as simply an appeal, like God will, come on God, support the home team, an appeal to heaven. They underestimated those boys and what they read. The phrase appeal to heaven comes straight from John Locke's second treatise, and they knew it, The Philosopher of Rights. In 1773, a Boston publisher advertised a new edition of Locke's work in the local newspaper. Listen to what the advertisement says. Perhaps there never was a time since the discovery of this new world when the people of all ranks everywhere show such an eager spirit of inquiry into the nature of their rights. This essay alone, Locke, well studied and attended to, will give every intelligent reader in Massachusetts a better view of his rights as a man and as an Englishman. Now, some historians have said, rights talk is loose, it's vague. Those country boys didn't really know what they were talking about, citing the great Mr. Locke, sometimes in their diaries spelled L-O-K. And some legal historians have said, there's difference between charter rights and natural rights and fundamental rights and rights of Englishmen and constitutional rights and God-given rights. It's a mess. How can you take rights seriously? Well, the boys that were at Bunker Hill knew what they were talking about. Well, it's perfectly true that ordinary Americans may not have followed the rigorous arguments of some philosophers. They were, in some important way, all vulgar Lockeans. They knew their rights. Out of everyday experience, they crafted a popular theory of rights that not only made common sense, but also justified the use of arms in the resistance to despotism. There's no need, I don't think, to over-intellectualize their thinking, but they did think. The common people are not just floating out there, they think. In diaries, sermons, letters to local committees, these people repeated and confidently proclaimed to whoever would listen that they had their rights. The language cannot be dismissed as simple window dressing. It formed the core of the understanding of the people who did the heavy lifting of our revolution. And the general outlines of their rights theory are not difficult to discern. I'll simply give it, but they blended the lessons of evangelical religion with the theory of rights in such a way that they would tell you that one not only has rights, but they're God-given rights. God is the arbiter of rights. As the Connecticut Current said in 1775, the rights of mankind to personal security, liberty, and private property are derived from the first great cause and are holden by divine tenure. The great charter of him that made us are natural to our very existence. Sometimes this religious wording makes academic audiences uncomfortable. But it did not make the people that were fighting the revolution uncomfortable. And they went on and they said that they had their rights, God-given rights, but with rights comes responsibility. Because if you find that you're living under a despot and do not do anything to proclaim your rights or defend your rights, you carry a responsibility to the Lord that gave you those rights. And these rights are universal, not for just white people, not just for women people, not for black people, but for human beings because of their birth. Everyone brings to the table a set of God-given rights. That's what they believed. And so there's a strong egalitarian streak in rights theory on the ground. And this rights talk energized small communities throughout America. How could it not? You can't have a revolution if it's a reading group at Harvard, you know. You got to get stirred up about stuff. The people had responsibilities, as the Reverend Peter Whitney told a group of soldiers as they were about to go into battle in 1776. In these cases, the people must judge for themselves of the good or ill conduct of the rulers. To the people, the rulers are accountable. And they also made it clear that simple annoyance at this or that, one tax, one policy, that was not enough. You cannot attack a ruler simply because you're unhappy with one aspect of policy. Rather, you had to prove to yourself in an appeal to heaven that your rights, as Reverend Fisk said, are against tyrannical, imperious, oppressive, repetitive oppression. Okay? You just can't just up and shoot somebody because you're unhappy with a tax. It's more than that. And this is an important point, because ordinary Americans who resisted king and parliament provide little comfort for those in our own time who claim that a single cause or a narrow political agenda justifies violence against neighbors or the state. Those who defied the British Empire spoke for the common good. They reached out to distant strangers and they created broad new political solidarities. They would have regarded those who are prepared to employ violence in the name of some self-interest, narrow self-interest, as threats to the security of a larger just society. And the words of rights spread. Anyone that hears them or heard them, pick them up. Black people, slaves. There were more black people at the time of the Revolution than there are today in proportion to the whole population. And most of them were unfree. They heard these words, these rights words. How close to the ground can you get to, let me give you an example, Cesar Sartor, a young man in Essex County. And he asked in the Salem paper, "This is a time of great anxiety and distress amongst you, readers, on account of the infringement, perhaps, of your charter rights and also your natural rights as freeborn men." And then he asks, "Would not those resisting the empire not pity and relieve the poor, distressed Africans who are enslaved, who, though they are entitled to the same natural rights as you are nevertheless groaning in bondage?" All the talk about slavery was not just against Parliament. There were real slaves listening to real words about Locke. Or how about in 1773, a petition of blacks living in Massachusetts, they wrote to Governor Thomas Hutchison. "Your petitioners, sir, apprehend that they have in common with other men a natural right to be free and without molestation to enjoy such property as they may acquire by their own industry or by any other means not detrimental to their fellow men," end quote. Rights talk is great. It spreads, it persuades, it empowers people who are sometimes at the bottom of society. Now, in closing, let me tell you that the ordinary people of the American Revolution sometimes failed to live up to their own principles. I'm not a romantic. They were sometimes violent, sometimes bigoted, sometimes intolerant. Sometimes the ordinary people are just plain pig-headed. And their behavior at these moments, however disturbing it may seem to us, I do not believe should send us running back to a historical narrative that chronicles great men doing great things. After all, as we've discovered, some of the founding fathers had feet of clay as well. Rather, I think we might respond to those in our own time who dream of taking the law into their own hands, to those who find violence against people of different religions and different races appealing, and to those who worry that rights talk throughout the world might encourage the oppressed to rise up against the interest of our country in some far-off post. To those people I say, we should take back our real revolution. We should be, in these times in the 21st century, true to an American story that protects law, believes in toleration, and celebrates universal rights.
We have a question right there.
I have a question, but first I would like to say, do you have a problem at times with the word tolerance? Because when you say you should be tolerant, it implies that there's something wrong with the other.
No, I see your point, and I think we agree. I mean, that's Williams's point. Is that toleration always implies that there's an authority who chooses not to be mean to you. And William's point, he says, we have a right to difference. That's where we start from. So don't really tell me about toleration. That's your problem. You see, yeah. So I think.
It implies that someone is being a martyr or
Right. Right.
Right.
Religious freedom is probably a better word. For my sins, I did attend law school for a while, and came to my senses. But the doctrine of equal protection that is celebrated in the 14th Amendment, I think has actually deep roots in before the Civil War in religious history, and so that the government's position on religion very on is the government doesn't tolerate religion. It gives equal protection to contending and competing groups. So Quakers don't start killing. Well, that's unbelievable. Catholics don't start killing Congregationalists. The Quakers never kill anybody. Yeah, go.
How do you think we would, if you make a great leap and say that our government today might be a threat to us?
Mm-hmm.
Not much of a leap.
Uh,
How do you think we would fare today?
That's very difficult. I can't speculate. Historians live in the past, but a strong federal authority is the best thing that has ever happened for people of color, gay people, people that don't have rights. And so when people start talking to me about the joys of local authorities or getting the federal government off their back, I say, have you ever experienced a pogrom or ever seen what local communities can do when a despised minority is up against the wall?
Related to that, I don't know if these two things are not related. Was there an appeals, any kind of appeals process that might start in Addison County in those days, either internal to the county or that allowed some forcefulness, forward.
Mm-hmm.
And in relationship to that, I mean, I think we're talking about more or less Christian toleration.
Yes, right, right.
And how were indigenous peoples and other spiritual things accounted for
right.
or discounted?
Right. There's limits. Look, I mean, we talk about rights, but slavery took the Civil War. There were Catholics, but they were nicely tucked away in Maryland. There were no Jews to talk about. Native American religious and spiritualism, give me a break. They were in our way for farmland. I mean, all I'm saying that is that certain principles and protocols that were established, and they were established on the ground by regular people, they themselves often didn't live up to their own high principles. But none of us do, really. I mean, I don't know what you think of our foreign policy, but there you go.
And any appeals process in the local judicial system?
Yeah. For a long time, the courts, I mean, the American Revolution, the war itself went on for a long time, 7 years, I think. But the hierarchies of courts, the appeals and whatnot, it got a little dodgy. Oftentimes, it was the locals who were making the rules, and then that was it. Some states did better than others about having appeals. New York did all right, but give you an idea of, if your little local community had a question with a Tory, you would take the problem up to what in New York was called the Committee for Observing and Exposing Conspiracies. The conspiracies, of course, are Tories. Well, it doesn't seem like much of an appeals body, but somehow it worked.
Sounds like a witch hunt.
Well, yes, but see, when I wrote my last book, I used the word insurgents to describe the kind of soldiers that showed up at Lexington and Concord, and people got really, really upset. They said, "Well, man, you have Iraq has insurgents, but not in America, for God's sake. I mean, we had country boy soldiers, Minutemen." And I say, revolutions are revolutions, and if you were a Tory, if you were an outspoken woman that said, "Let's have a toast to George III," and you're in New York and it's about 1777, you're not going to have a good day. Sir.
That was going to be my question. What happened with a lot of the Tory property?
Much of it was confiscated, and that is one of the, I always urge my graduate students to do it because I don't have the courage. Huge amounts of property were liberated during the war. Vermont, I think, had the absolute best system, was totally corrupt, and it hid under the veil of patriotism. And New York had a very similar. Let me tell you how it went. This is great. You asked, yes?
I've been reading a book called Albion Sea.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And it's very interesting because the author shows that
folk memories of, yes.
from those eastern counties of
Right.
Essex
Mm-hmm.
in England
Mm-hmm.
was carried almost in toto to the Puritan
Right, yeah.
Massachusetts.
It's a very interesting argument. Let me just, before I lose my train of thought here, just go back to how the good people of Vermont financed the revolution, because we were involved, obviously. A Tory would be, a name would appear, a suspect person. And a committee of safety and observation would go and visit this person, and if it was proved, now oftentimes the person had already left, and so the property's vacant, but sometimes, but anyway, it was taken up for the public good and then sold at auction, right? And the money for the auction went to support the war, and then people like Ethan Allen and others would tell the people of Vermont, "Isn't this great? You can have your war and no taxes," because they were getting. But it's even cleverer, because at auction, some of the really wonderful pieces of property always seem to land in the Allen family. So it wasn't a redistribution of property, it was a circular process. New York had the same way. 60,000 people emigrated from the country during the Revolution because they are Tories or Loyalists. They couldn't stand it. It's one of the largest emigre communities ever documented, far more than the people that left France during the French Revolution. These are people for their own principles that they left. Many went to Nova Scotia. A large number went to England. And it's one of my students found, then I will stop yammering. Very interesting what happened to a lot of the Loyalists that went to Nova Scotia. They got up there and they had one of them, like a royal governor there. I think his name was Lawrence. He was a governor from hell. He was an authoritarian jerk. And so these loyalists get up there and he's saying, you go here, you do this and everything. They said, well, geez, we have our rights. And he said, well, you sound like American patriots. And well, they did in a different context. They had absorbed a lot of the stuff we're talking about tonight. Yes, ma'am.
So, what was the communication or connection then between the Founding Fathers and the comic populace? I mean, was there a way, were they like two parallel impulses, or was there a way?
Well, they worked in tandem. Again, I'm not dismissing the Founding Fathers. I mean, they key points. I mean, without Washington, it would. What I think people that study the American Revolution forget is that revolutions are often won or lost nowhere near battlefields. It's maintaining loyalty oaths. It's making sure your neighbors are with the cause. And this committee system that was formed throughout America on the local level was extremely effective at what you might call ideologically policing the revolution. Right? And so, I mean, most of the last years of the revolution were fought in the South. But you might say, well, maybe Tories in Pennsylvania and New Jersey would say that, Washington's down there in Yorktown. It didn't happen. It didn't happen because of this committee system. It's very similar to what happened in France, where you have committees of safety and whatnot. It's just that, again, I'm repeating myself, this kind of vocabulary, committees of safety, insurgents, is not part of the way we think about our revolution, right? We think of the 3 or 4 guys that did good things and led us to victory, and God talked to Washington and whatnot. There's a book that was been written recently. It's in the top 200 on Amazon. I don't remember. It's one of the Fox News people that wrote this book. And he said the revolution was entirely God's plan. It was preordained. You want to understand the revolution, you find God's message, what he was whispering to Washington. I mean, you say, fine, but where's the evidence? Show me the tapes.
I'm thinking as you trace a couple of decades after the American Revolution,
Yes.
you can see some recurrence being actually put in place. So when you look at rights, you can see the northern states do eliminate slavery, not necessarily
Right.
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 Reasons, but they do eliminate slavery. You find people like Jedediah Morse in 1790 saying, America was founded as a Christian republic.
Right.
Rights, though, you get to 1786, Shays Rebellion, other agrarian.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting. I think this bifurcation really plays itself out in the Constitution drafting and ratification. Because in a sense, you could make a case, I'm not going to make it at this hour to you people, but one could make the case that the Constitution is in some way a denial of the spirit of the revolution. It's a control, it's a pulling back in some way. But the rights discourse was saved in the first 10 amendments. I mean, the anti-federalists didn't lose. They influenced, they protected those rights. And again, the 10 amendments to the Constitution don't say that the government of the United States gives the people the right of free speech or free assembly. It says you have that right, and our job is to protect that right. It's a very important move, and I think that's in the true revolutionary spirit.
An idea. You talked a little bit about the people who went because they were Tories.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you had any connection with the DAR. I don't hear much about it now, and it may not be.
Well, no, there's chapters everywhere. Yeah, they're up.
Well, my idea is the people who belong to the DAR usually are fairly well off financially.
Mm-hmm.
They would have been all Tories at the time of the revolution.
Well, genealogy is a wonderful art. Some Tories did come back. I've had graduate students, some Tories came back and wanted their land back in Vermont, New York, it happened. And some got their land back and some didn't. And even up in New York State, at the highest appeals level of the courts, there are Tory land claims being adjudicated up until the 1830s. I mean, this is, property gets people, yeah, and probably the children or the litigants or the heirs and whatnot. But no one has, I think, no historian I know has unraveled Tory land claims. And the reason is there are a lot of folks that didn't want them unraveled, right? I mean, if your total claim to land is that you occupied it during the Revolution or you purchased it in a somewhat dodgy auction, you're not real eager to have folks doing, title insurance.
Dodgy auction, the Native Americans have a position.
Yeah, well, they do, and the courts have increasingly accepted that position. But the Tories are a lost cause.
We have
Yeah.
one last question over here.
Yeah.
Well, that's juxtaposed against the Japanese
Mhm.
Americans on the West Coast who lost their
Yes.
property to their neighbors and who were fine with taking it. But I wondered, does Ethan Allen have any influence outside of Vermont, any writings or whatever? I know he was in prison for a while.
Yeah, I just wrote a long piece about Ethan Allen, and the answer is he had almost no influence outside of the state, with one exception. His rather poignant story about being a prisoner of war was a kind of a pop bestseller, and I think it did inspire a certain kind of flush of patriotism far outside. It was an important print statement, but if you, well, I love Vermont. I'm not going to make, but Ethan Allen is. Let me just say he and his brothers are very problematic figures. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.